A desperate cowboy rode into the canyon only to stumble on a truth darker than his debts. The girl everyone believed was long dead was still alive. She had been hidden for years by the ruthless Crawford brothers, men who ruled the canyon through fear and cruelty. But fate placed Caleb Harper in their path, and one choice turned his theft into a battle for justice. And just wait until you hear how this fight ended, and why in the end hope rose where despair once lived. Caleb Harper moved like a shadow through the canyon, his boots sinking into the loose gravel as the pale light of the moon painted the cliffs in silver and blue. He was 26, but the hard years had carved lines into his face that belonged to a much older man. Debt had followed him like a wolf, closing in closer with each season. His father's ranch was a dying patch of earth, its fences broken, its soil too dry to yield crops, and the bank circling like a hawk. Caleb had never wanted to be the kind of man who took what wasn't his, but sometimes desperation drives a man down trails he swore he'd never ride. Tonight, his plan was simple. Steal a pair of wild mustangs grazing deep in the canyon, lead them out under cover of darkness, and sell them in the next town. Enough money to keep the ranch afloat for another month, maybe two. The canyon seemed alive with sound, the echo of insects, the faint rush of water far below, the restless snorts of horses unsettled by his presence. Caleb held his breath and counted each careful step, his hand resting on the worn leather of the lasso coiled at his side. The herd was close, and the weight in his chest lifted just slightly. Success felt almost within reach. But then something cut through the night. So faint at first, he thought it was the wind whistling between the rocks. It wasn't the cry of a coyote, nor the restless call of a bird. It was a whisper, hoarse, broken, and far too human. Caleb froze, the hair at the back of his neck rising. He told himself it was nothing, just nerves playing tricks on a man already half guilty in his heart. Yet the sound came again, thin and trembling as though scraped out of a throat unused to speech. His eyes swept the canyon walls, the shadowed ridges, until they caught on something out of place. At the base of a crumbling clay outcrop near where the mustangs pawed at the earth, a small figure crouched, barely visible in the gloom. For an instant, Caleb's mind rebelled. His first thought was ghost. The old stories told around campfires came rushing back. The canyon was said to be haunted by those who wandered too far and never returned. The figure was small, draped in tatters of fabric that might once have been a dress, hair long and tangled as brambles. Caleb's pulse thundered, his mouth dry, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he stayed. Something in the way the figure trembled, something in the fragile shape of those shoulders rooted him to the spot. Slowly, the figure raised its head, and when the moonlight slid across her face, Caleb's heart nearly stopped. Eyes wide and hollow, cheeks sunken but unmistakably alive, he knew her. He had seen that face in fading posters nailed to saloon walls, in the worn drawings that hung in the sheriff's office, in the haunted eyes of her grieving mother who came to town each month to beg for news. Emily Rose, the rancher's daughter who had vanished 3 years ago without a trace, the girl every family in the county had mourned, whispered about, and eventually buried only in their memories. Caleb staggered back a step, his breath catching. It couldn't be. Everyone had said she was gone for good. The search parties had come back empty, the reward posters yellowed with time, and hope had dried up like the riverbeds in summer. Yet here she was, thin as a reed, wrapped in rags, her eyes staring at him as though she wasn't sure if he was real. He felt the lasso slip from his hand, the thought of horses, money, and debt scattering like dust in the wind. This canyon, which moments ago had been just a hiding place for wild mustangs, had turned into something else entirely, something darker, something with secrets carved into its stone walls. Caleb knew then that whatever path he had set out on tonight, he was no longer walking it. Fate had dragged him onto another trail, one that would demand more of him than he ever imagined. Emily's lips parted and the faintest sound escaped, more air than voice, a plea, a warning, or maybe both. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he realized one truth that swallowed everything else. Emily Rose was alive, and the canyon was not empty. Caleb nearly dropped the lantern as his fingers trembled around the handle, the weak flame inside swaying wildly and casting long, jagged shadows across the canyon wall. For a heartbeat, the world tilted, every sound fading except the rasp of his own breath. The girl was alive. She wasn't some vision conjured by exhaustion, or the tricks of the moonlight. She was flesh and bone, standing before him with eyes so wide and frightened they seemed to swallow the darkness. Her frame was thin, fragile, as if the desert winds might carry her away. Her hair fell in wild knots over her face, and when she moved back into the gloom, she looked more like a ghost than a child. "Don't, please," she whispered, the words breaking apart like brittle wood. The voice was cracked, strained, carrying the weight of silence that had stretched over years. It wasn't the voice of a child who had spent her days laughing in sunlit meadows. It was the voice of someone who had been forgotten, someone who had fought to keep even the faintest piece of herself alive. Caleb's throat tightened, and he felt the breath snag in his chest. The sound of her plea dug into him deeper than any blade could. Memories rushed at him, fragments of half-forgotten conversations and the way folks used to lower their voices whenever her name came up. He recalled the posters tacked to the walls of the sheriff's office, the rewards promised, the prayer circles that had gone quiet when weeks turned into months with no sign. He remembered the whispers in saloons. Some blamed outlaws passing through the hills. Others swore wild animals had taken her. And a few muttered about the abandoned mines that scarred the canyon floor. Every theory ended the same way, with the certainty that she was gone and hope had no place in the story. But here she was, and the truth was standing in front of him, shattering every story told around firelit tables. From the far end of the canyon, a sound cut into the stillness. The sharp bark of dogs and the coarse timbre of men's voices rolling like thunder along the rocks. Caleb stiffened, turning his ear toward the echoes. The girl's body flinched at the sound, her shoulders curling in as though she had learned through pain to make herself small. Her lips trembled, and in a voice so faint he almost missed it, she breathed, "They're coming back." The words sank into Caleb like ice water. He felt his pulse pound in his ears, the meaning as clear as daylight. Whoever had taken her, whoever had stolen 3 years of her life, they were not ghosts or animals or accidents of fate. They were men. Men who walked and spoke and hunted with dogs at their heels. Men who had kept her hidden all this time in the cracks of the canyon, away from the reach of law, family, and prayer. Caleb's first instinct was to run, to pull her with him and vanish into the night before those voices drew closer. But his boots felt rooted to the ground, his mind battling against the truth unraveling in front of him. She hadn't been lost to wilderness or swallowed by earth. She had been held here, guarded like a secret no one was meant to uncover. The canyon itself seemed to tighten around them, the high walls closing in, heavy with the knowledge of what they had witnessed in silence. The girl's eyes searched his face, pleading for something he wasn't sure he had to give. Protection, rescue, a promise that she wouldn't be dragged back into the shadows once more. Caleb's heart thundered as he realized how fragile this moment was. One wrong move, one loud sound, and the men closing in would discover them. And yet standing still was no option. He could no longer pretend he was just a desperate rancher chasing mustangs. That life had ended the moment he looked into her eyes. Caleb understood then with a clarity that cut deeper than fear. She had survived years not because of fate or mercy, but because of her own will to endure. And now it fell to him, a man who came into the canyon as a thief, to decide whether he would leave as one, or whether he would shoulder the weight of truth he had stumbled upon. The debt, the mustangs, the schemes that had driven him into the night, all of it meant nothing compared to the quiet terror trembling in the girl's voice. He shifted his grip on the lantern, lowering its light to shield her face from the approaching glow of torches flickering somewhere beyond the bend. The dogs barked again, louder this time, their sound bouncing off the canyon walls like a warning bell. Caleb's jaw tightened as his mind finally accepted what his heart already knew. This was no haunting, no accident of wilderness. Emily Rose had been a prisoner, and those men were her captors. The canyon had kept their secret for too long. Caleb's fate was now entwined with hers, whether he wanted it or not. Dot, from the dark curve of the canyon wall, 3 shapes emerged, their boots crunching against loose stone, rifles glinting faintly in the moonlight. Caleb's grip tightened instinctively around the lantern, his stomach knotting when recognition struck. The Crawford brothers. Every ranch hand in the county knew the name, and none spoke it without a bitter taste in their mouths. Men who lived by intimidation, carving out stretches of land as if the law had no reach. They weren't outlaws in the usual sense, no masks, no reckless raids, but worse, mercenaries who thrived on fear, men who treated the canyon like their personal kingdom. Now, as they stepped into view, Caleb realized the canyon's darkest secret wasn't the wild mustangs. It was the child they had hidden all this time. Jed Crawford, the eldest, carried himself with the smugness of a man convinced of his invulnerability. His hat was pulled low, his jaw shadowed with rough stubble, and his eyes glimmered with cruel amusement as they fell on Caleb. "Well, well," Jed drawled, his voice carrying a lazy menace. "Harper thought you could slip in here and steal what's ours? The horses I might have forgiven, maybe? But you went and laid eyes on something you shouldn't have." His grin widened, sharp and humorless. "Our little secret." Emily pressed herself against Caleb's side, her trembling small frame like a blade cutting through his hesitation. Her eyes, wide with terror, clung to his as though they could anchor her in the storm. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply looked at him, silently begging for one thing. "Don't let them take me back." Behind Jed stood his brothers, Earl, lanky and restless with a cruel twitch of a smile, and Cole, broad-shouldered and silent, his eyes cold as stone. Together they looked less like men and more like a wall, a blockade of flesh and malice that had ruled these canyons unchallenged for years. Caleb had heard tales whispered in saloons, of ranchers who strayed too close to their claimed territory, of threats carved into fence posts, of herds that disappeared in the night. But this was beyond rumor. This was the truth unveiled, and it stood only a few steps away. Caleb's chest burned as fury rose in him, hotter and heavier with every breath. He had ridden into the canyon thinking himself a thief, a man crossing lines out of desperation. Yet, standing here with the Crawford brothers grinning like predators and the child clinging to his side, he saw that his crime was nothing compared to theirs. He hadn't stolen years of a girl's life. He hadn't shackled her to shadows and silence. He hadn't turned the canyon into a prison. His mind raced. He could turn and run, leave Emily to her fate, hope the Crawfords never came looking for him later. It would be the practical choice, the safer choice. He'd live to fight another day, maybe find a way to tell the law. But even as the thought flickered, it withered beneath the weight of Emily's gaze. Those pleading eyes spoke louder than any words. She'd been abandoned before, written off as lost, and if he left her now, she wouldn't survive it again. Jed tilted his rifle casually against his shoulder, the motion almost playful, but the threat beneath it unmistakable. "This canyon don't take kindly to witnesses," he said, voice low and even. Earl laughed under his breath, a jagged sound that bounced off the rock walls. Cole stayed silent, his stare fixed on Caleb like a hunter watching prey. The world seemed to narrow in that moment, the canyon closing tight, the air itself charged with the weight of choice. Caleb could feel the girl's small fingers gripping the edge of his sleeve, her silent plea echoing through every beat of his heart. He had come for horses, he had come for money to keep his family afloat, but fate had set something far heavier in his path, a truth too monstrous to ignore, and a test of what kind of man he truly was. As the dogs barked in the distance and the moonlight glinted off the Crawfords' rifles, Caleb's fury steadied into resolve. He was no longer deciding whether to steal or to flee. He was deciding whether to stand as a shield against the darkness that had ruled this canyon or to let it swallow another soul. And though his body trembled, though every instinct screamed of the danger, one truth rang louder than fear. He could not walk away. Dot bullets sparked against the stone, fragments scattering like fireflies in the dark as Caleb pulled Emily with him. Their bodies pressed low to the ground. He dragged her behind a boulder worn smooth by years of storms, the only shield between them and the Crawford rifles. His chest heaved, his heart pounding with such force it felt like it would shatter through his ribs. He knew the truth with brutal clarity. One man against three armed brothers was a battle no gambler would ever wager on. But when his eyes met Emily's, wide and terrified, yet clinging to him as if he were the last thread between her and despair, something inside him burned hotter than fear. He couldn't turn away now, not when she had already been abandoned by everyone else. The sound of boots echoed closer, rough voices bouncing off the canyon walls. Caleb leaned close, his voice barely more than a breath, steady though his hands shook around the rifle. "Run to the creek," he whispered, his lips near her tangled hair. "Follow the rocks and don't look back. I'll hold them off." Emily shook her head violently, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "They'll kill you," she rasped, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she'd endured. Caleb swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he pulled the rifle tight against his shoulder. "That's not your worry," he said, his tone low but fierce. "Go, live." The next seconds erupted into chaos. A shot rang out, the bark of a rifle splitting the silence, and Caleb answered with his own. The recoil kicked into his shoulder, and a cry split the night as one of the brothers staggered and collapsed into the dirt. For a heartbeat, victory tasted sharp, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Another figure lunged from the shadows, Earl Crawford, charging with reckless fury, no longer content to hide behind a gun. He crashed into Caleb, and the two men slammed into the ground, fists, elbows, and desperation colliding in a blur. The rifle skittered out of reach, clattering against the stone. Caleb's body screamed with exhaustion, every muscle strained, but the thought of Emily, of her frail voice begging him not to give up, pushed him past the limits he thought he had. The canyon became a storm of struggle, each sound magnified. The scrape of boots on stone, the grunt of impact, the ragged breath of men locked in a fight neither could afford to lose. Caleb's vision blurred, his arms trembling under Earl's weight, but he twisted with a surge of will, forcing himself upright. He wasn't fighting for honor. He wasn't fighting for some story to tell. He was fighting for a girl who had been erased from the world, left to fade in silence, until fate set him on this path. Emily crouched behind the boulder, her small frame shaking as she clutched her knees to her chest. She wanted to scream, to run to him, but her body betrayed her, frozen between terror and hope. Her wide eyes tracked Caleb's every movement, the wild desperation in his struggle reminding her of something she hadn't felt in years. Someone was willing to fight for her, someone who refused to hand her back into darkness. Caleb's knuckles split as he drove a punch into Earl's jaw, forcing him back, buying just enough space to snatch the rifle from the ground. His breath came in gasps, his chest burning, but his spirit refused to break. He fired again, the shot echoing like thunder through the canyon. Earl stumbled, his figure folding against the rocks. For a fleeting instant, the world went quiet except for Caleb's ragged breathing and Emily's sharp, uneven sobs. But there was still Jed, the eldest Crawford, calm and calculating, who had held back while his brothers surged forward. His shadow loomed from the far side of the canyon, rifle steady, eyes burning with cold fury. Caleb locked eyes with him, the weight of the moment pressing heavy on both men. He knew Jed wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't back down. But Caleb felt something shift deep within him, a raw resolve stronger than fear, sharper than doubt. He had already crossed the line, there was no turning back. As Emily clung to the edge of the boulder, her gaze fixed on him with unspoken trust, Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle. He was not the man who had entered this canyon searching for mustangs. That man was gone, replaced by someone who had discovered a purpose greater than himself. He had come seeking profit, but he found a truth that demanded blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He would not abandon it. With the canyon echoing like a drum, Caleb steadied his breath, raised the rifle once more, and prepared to face the storm head on. He wasn't fighting for money. He wasn't fighting for survival alone. He was fighting for Emily Rose, the girl the world had buried in memory, the child whose life deserved to be reclaimed from the shadows. And with that thought blazing in his chest, he stepped forward into the fire dot. By the time the first pale streaks of dawn stretched across the canyon walls, the storm had ended. The echoes of gunfire had faded into silence, leaving only the steady song of morning birds and the sigh of the wind weaving between the rocks. Jed Crawford lay at the base of the cliff, his hands bound with Caleb's rope, his pride as battered as the body he now leaned against the stone. For years he had ruled this canyon as though it were his private empire, but the night had stripped him of that power. His cold eyes smoldered with the fury of a man who had lost more than a fight. He had lost the secret he had guarded so ruthlessly. Caleb stood over him for a moment, the rifle still heavy in his hands, but the sight of Emily sitting nearby anchored him to something deeper than vengeance. The girl was hunched close to Caleb's saddlebag, her frail fingers clutching a crust of bread as though it were treasure. Each bite was careful, hesitant, as if her body had forgotten the act of eating, yet her eyes glimmered with something fragile and new. Caleb watched her, his throat tightening. He had seen hunger before, seen families scraping by through lean winters, but this was different. This was survival carved into every movement. And yet as she chewed, as crumbs clung to her lips, there was also something unmistakable, life returning, a spark that refused to be buried. When they finally rode back toward town, the rising sun painted the horizon in fire. Caleb led his horse slowly. Emily balanced carefully before him, her head resting lightly against his chest. The closer they drew to the settlement, the more the weight of what had happened pressed against his mind. He had entered the canyon as a man blinded by debt, driven by desperation to take what wasn't his. He was leaving it carrying a truth that would shake the entire town awake. Word spread even before they reached the main street. The sight of Emily perched in front of Caleb, her face pale but alive, froze people where they stood. A hush fell over the crowd as neighbors spilled from their doors, their morning chores forgotten, their disbelief painted plain across their faces. Then, through the sea of silence, a cry broke, a raw, desperate sound. Emily's mother pushed her way forward, stumbling as if her legs no longer trusted the ground beneath them. She fell to her knees before her daughter, arms trembling as they wrapped around the child she had mourned for years. The crowd could only watch, their voices rising in hushed whispers, prayers, and tears. Some covered their mouths, others bowed their heads, but all of them felt the same truth settle in their bones. They were witnessing a miracle. A girl stolen from life now returned as the sun broke over the hills. Caleb stepped back, letting the moment belong to them. He felt strangely apart from the joy, as though he were watching from outside the circle of light. He had no claim to the gratitude flowing through the crowd, no place among their praise. In his mind, he was still the man who had crept into the canyon to steal, a man who had chosen a path of shadows for the sake of survival. If not for chance or fate, he might have left that canyon with horses instead of truth. And yet, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it was he who had been chosen to bear this weight, to find Emily, to bring her home. As he turned his gaze toward the sky, Caleb felt something stirring in his chest, something he hadn't carried in years. It wasn't pride. It wasn't victory. It was release. The burden of his debts, the shame of his choices, the gnawing hunger that had driven him into dishonor, all of it seemed smaller now, distant in the light of what had been restored. He hadn't come seeking redemption, but somehow he had found a measure of it in the frightened eyes of a girl who now held on to her mother as if she would never let go again. The town would remember the day differently. They would tell stories of Emily's return, of the Crawfords brought low, of a miracle carved out of the canyon's darkness. Caleb knew his name would surface in those stories, but he didn't crave it. He didn't need it. He had found something rarer than recognition. He had found the quiet peace of knowing he had stood between innocence and ruin, and he had not faltered. As the sun climbed higher and the crowd swelled with awe, Caleb lingered at the edge, unseen by most, a figure half in shadow and half in light. He had gone into the canyon as a thief, but he walked away as something else entirely, a man who had given back hope to a world that thought it lost. And in the stillness of his heart, there bloomed a word he had not felt in years, fragile yet unshakable: relief.